Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 61 of China Talk. As you may notice, something's a bit different today, and that's one extra white person is going to be talking about China. I know we're all very excited about the new change, aren't we?
Yes.
Welcome, Andy.
So
Thank-
this is Andy. I'm just going to introduce him very quickly. We wanted to look for a host with a personality. No offense, Raz.
Yeah.
So we're hoping that Andy can kind of control the discussion a little bit better and keep us from rambling too much. And
mean-
Andy watches China, so he kind of knows what he's talking about.
Just a little bit, a tad. Like, I know that the players are Chinese. Well, not all of them. Not anymore.
Already a
What?
strike against you. Okay.
Okay. So basically, a lot's happened since the last episode. I am San Jose happened. We found out that EDG, isn't going to Cologne, and QG is going to be replacing them. But the biggest news that I feel like we should be talking about is that Banana Plan, which is owned by Wang Sicong. That's right, he owns it, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so he he also happens to be the owner of Invictus Gaming. He bought the broadcasting and administrative rights to LPL from PLU, and that's kind of really big news just because what it could mean for the upcoming LPL broadcast, production and all that stuff. So I feel like that's probably going to be the bulk of our show, and if after we've properly exhausted the topic, we will, talk about the various roster news that's been going on since there's been, quite a bit in the last few days, and maybe we could talk about the upcoming tournaments. But, we ready to start, guys?
Yes.
Ready? Yep.
Okay, awesome. So let's start out with who Wang Sicong actually is, because so far we just know that he is filthy rich and he owns Invictus Gaming. But there's honestly more to this guy, and I feel like we kind of need to understand him a little bit more, just to understand this situation in general. So, Kelsey, since you're probably the best person to to introduce him, why don't you get started us off?
So Wang Sicong is actually a really interesting figure in both the economic and political sphere of China. First of all, he is the son of the richest man in China, Wang Jianlin, who owns this thing called Wanda Group, which is a really big subsidiary, owns a lot of property, but probably anyone who's heard of it in the West will know it by AMC Theaters, is a subsidiary of Wanda Group. But as a result, he has like $39 billion or something, like United States dollars or something like this, and he is the richest man in China. Wang Sicong, in the past, Invictus Gaming and his video gaming exploits have been separate from Wanda Group, but he's effectively given, I think it's 1% of Wanda Group's profits to do whatever he wants with, in addition to owning his own businesses and enterprises. So he started obviously with the gaming club Invictus Gaming, which was purchased from Catastrophic Cruel Memory, but now he's branched out into owning a streaming platform and now buying LPL, as well as some of his other investments, which I don't know as much about.
Just to briefly say, tell us the streaming platform.
Panda TV.
Okay.
So Panda TV is a new streaming platform this year,
Yeah.
and the reason why Wang Sicong is such a big deal is because of the streaming industry in China, which is nothing like in the US, because it's more than just like a gaming subculture. It's also, there are a lot of elaborate streaming television shows and all these sorts of things. There was a quote in an Economist article, which I can put on the screen for you, which said that in the course of a year, 70% of households watched TV in 2014. Then by the end of 2015, there's like 30% or something like that watch television, and now because they watch streams, and there's a lot of restriction placed on television in China and the stuff that you can kind of put on a TV. Political content, and it's as weird as banning depictions of time travel which, whatever.
We won't be having any Doctor Who in this country.
But it takes a really long time for shows to get approved, and sometimes they don't get approved or things like that. So you put a lot of investment into creating the show just to have it not air, and then you don't necessarily have that much control over the content that gets put on it. Whereas streaming platforms, because probably the government didn't think they'd get that big, they gave the responsibility of regulating content on streams to the companies that own the streaming platforms. So that means that if Wang Sicong says it's okay for me to air Doctor Who, I can air Doctor Who in China on a stream.
By the power.
By the power of Wang Sicong. The interesting thing is because all of this content stuff is heavily regulated by the Chinese government, and the fact that Wang Zhenlin makes so much money is not a coincidence, right? He's very well connected to the Communist Party. And so the fact that his son is kind of part of this streaming revolution that, and it's not like people are creating these super political shows like burn the Communist Party, like they don't care as much about that. They just want to be able to watch what they want to watch, right? Like the kind of entertainment that they want to see.
Yeah.
And League of Legends actually takes a big part center stage in a lot of these headline acts. So when you think about why are all these Koreans coming to China, it's because the streaming platforms are throwing money to get bigger personalities so that people will watch their streaming platforms because of how big of an industry it is. And that's why the bubble isn't really deflating yet.
One thing that really struck me about just in general when doing research on Wang Sicong, he's like there was this BBC interview with him basically, and they went through and looked at comments from like Weibo and other places, and it's basically like for young people in China, he's become this kind of like weird, like in spite of being basically like a nouveau riche, like second generation, like super rich person, he's become this like weird cult hero because a lot of younger educated Chinese people see him as being on their side. And again, it's not like, oh my gosh, let's overthrow the Chinese government. It's more like, oh, through online gaming, we can do what we want. And I thought there was a really interesting quote from his interview that basically says like, everyone has their own ideas, so what they do is put on a mask and they go forward in life with a mask. Why is online gaming becoming so popular in China? Because once you go online, you can take off that mask and say whatever you really think rather than what's mainstream. And I thought that was like a really interesting quote, and I guess explains like this weird cult hero status that he kind of has, which I found like incredibly interesting, and how intrinsically it's tied to not only like streaming but online streaming of video games.
Okay, so basically we've established that he's sort of like the rock star for the new generation of Chinese youth. And you know, which I mean, which is fair. Like that's fine. That's perfectly fine. You know, we're just gonna ignore the fact that he's still the son of like the wealthiest man in China, but
and still tied to the Communist Party. Whatever.
Yeah, and, there's probably a lot of political motivation, but behind what he does. But okay, so so now we got a better idea of like who he is like as a person and sort of like his interests. Why don't we talk about exactly what the acquisition of LPL sort of means, from this point forward, as well as, what changes we could expect now that, Banana Plan have the rights. And there was the statement saying that Riot China would be working closely with them, so we would be allegedly expecting more influence from them than they have in the past. Because from what we understand, and you can clarify this a bit further, Riot China hasn't seemingly had much influence in the past. You mentioned earlier that it was mostly PLU representatives during LPL games as opposed to Riot representatives. So let's touch on that, Kelsey.
Right. So the typical experience of, I guess, going to LCS or Worlds as someone who has press is you have a separate press area backstage, and you consult Riot employees if you want to interview players, and they talk to the teams for you and all these sorts of things. So there's definitely a very, and I speak from a press perspective because obviously that's my experience at tournaments and things like that. And it's not necessarily good or bad. Like, there are definitely good things about that because it's like you don't have the press constantly harassing teams and players for interviews, just like pulling them off a game and things like that. But it also gives a sense that there's a very big Riot presence in the LCS, at the World Championship, things like that. At China, it's run by, this past year, it's been run by PLU, which is the company that's always run LPL until this coming year. And it's run by the League of Legends Association of Chinese Esports, which is effectively like KESPA for people familiar with Korean League of Legends. It's a group of team owners, effectively. And obviously, you have political connections in KESPA, you have political connections in China because it's run by rich people, and rich people are usually well connected to the Communist Party. So it's a very, very similar setup. So you have LDOT Ace, and then you have PLU, and there's very, very little Riot presence. So as a press agent, you can go up to the teams yourself, ask them to interview their players. You can sit backstage with the teams. It's just like much less, there's much less of a Riot presence or a Riot feel to it, and the lace agents are kind of just wandering around to make sure everything's copacetic, whatever else comes with that. So this is kind of the difference in how LPL has been in the past, and then how you can kind of envision some of the Riot having a much more heavy presence, maybe going forward with Banana Plan, if they're going to be more involved.
If being, the big question here, because, again, that's something, it seems like that's what they're counting on as opposed to, the past. So, I mean, what else can we expect, now that Wang Sicong is essentially in charge? I mean, obviously, like, this seems to be like a conflict of interest considering he's also a team owner, but again, China's also seemed to be, familiar with conflicts of interest. So what do you expect any really negative implications from all this?
In terms of the conflict of interest, I think it would be mostly related to what sort of advertising material are we doing for LPL now? Is Rookie going to be the face of the league? Is Zitai's face going to be on all of your LPL? Are other teams going to be selling their gear at the? Because right now at the LPL venue, you can buy gear from a bunch of other teams that Lace has effectively considered, popular. So if you're a Lace team, right, your stuff is at the venue and available for sale.
Okay.
So if Wang Sicong owns the LPL, is it all going to be IG gear? Like, buy your IG gear here, guys.
Well, those white jerseys are spiffy in a very minimalistic way, if I do say so myself, but call it preference. Okay, so Raz, what do you what questions have sort of popped into your mind since the news kind of broke out?
Mostly, yes. The biggest one, of course, being the conflict of interest. And it's not so much just the fear of that in and of itself, but the rule set in general. Because, of course, when the whole the two-team system kind of got destroyed, you had teams like World Elite. They had World Elite Academy, and you're like, you know what? We're going to have M3 Masters 3, and then so the rule set became kind of a joke in terms of creating no conflict of interest. And then now that they have Wang Sicong having control, and he also has a team in the league. Sure, I'm not worried that there's going to be a conflict of interest, but it just really comes down to the effectiveness of these rule sets, and they become a joke for the most part. And I know that Riot is going to have more presence, I suppose. But the biggest problem for me is that I know most of these rules are a joke. To be honest, I feel like most of these rules I don't care for. But if you're going to have the rules, you might as well make them enforced, I guess. It's really stupid otherwise. I don't know. It's this that's my point on it.
Are you saying that any statement or any stance that Wang Sicong or Banana Plan or Riot or Blaze have on his conflict of interest is going to be a kind of a formality and not actually what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess, like, piggybacking on that point, I know we talked about previously when Kelsey first released an article that said that they were in talks, and initially we just thought Riot China was going to take over it, right? Or they were going to have a like larger presence. As it turns out, Wang Sicong was like, nope, like I'll just buy the whole league, which is like honestly hilarious and just I don't know, it's really funny to me.
Yeah.
But I think prior to that, like they had listed a lot of things that they wanted to do in China, which we all kind of agreed were really to put it in the nicest perspective and overly ambitious. In terms of being like, oh, we really want to make sure that the age limit is reinforced. We really want to make sure that all this elo boosting stops. We really want to make sure like all of these different things. And I guess I'm wondering if that's like still something that they're going to be focusing on, if supposedly Riot China is going to be working closely with Banana Plan, or if like that it is all just a formality and they just threw so much money at them. And since it's Tencent, which I'm sure Kelsey's going to want to touch upon too, like how important the fact that Tencent like owns Riot Games basically, because that's actually a huge important economic like thing involved in this. But like there are things that they wanted to tackle that I'm not sure if Banana Plan was just like, oh yeah, sure, we'll do that, and then just threw them so much money that maybe they'll like conveniently forget about it, or what's gonna go on with that, I guess, is I'm curious. But it's weird because I'm oddly more, and maybe this is just a warped perspective for me, but like I'm oddly more at ease with Wang Sicong controlling the LPL than I was with Riot China, which I don't know what that says about my own wacky perspective, but
no,
Well-
I agree as well.
Well, when we talk about conflict of interest, there's always been a question of the conflict of interest when Riot runs and administers their own leagues because they also own the game, right? So either way, you're kind of looking at a situation where you have question marks, like where is this going to go?
That's true.
Fair enough. Like, I mean, in the past, you know, Chinese League has sort of like danced around like the rule set, like in you know in ambiguity, and you know nothing's really changed, and it seems like now we maybe not like rules might be enforced a little bit more strictly, because Riot China allegedly says they'll you know have like a tighter grip, but for all we know that could just be you know PRs, and then nothing will eventually change, just different ownership and you know same gray area. Thing I still want to touch upon is what Emily said earlier about that Kelsey wanted to talk about a little bit more about the case of intellectual property.
Yeah.
So like what again, you know, Tencent having ownership of the game and stuff, like what you know is issues with that, like you know anything you want to touch upon, Kelsey?
So this brings also in you can tie this into the OGN side too, is the idea of who actually owns the intellectual property of the league, who actually owns the intellectual property of the game. Because in a lot of the Riot contracts and statements on things, you can see things like anyone who plays the game, their footage or their whatever happens while they play the game can be used by Riot and is the intellectual property of Riot. So your playing time and your streaming is technically owned by Riot Games if you stream or anything like that. So then obviously if you have game footage in a league, that should, by that clause, be the intellectual property of Riot Games. This is true like in Korea, in China, or whatever. But then the question becomes, well, how much of the league is based just on the game footage, right? Is based on all this other stuff. Like OGN has put in so much of their own investment into the intellectual property of the broadcast itself, not just the games. Having the venues, putting money into even part of the teams and all these other things. So the same can be said for PLU, which is effectively the OGN equivalent, because it's it's like the oldest esports organization in China, except that the Chinese people don't really like PLU. So this is the this is the difference. A lot of the Chinese people were kind of happy with Wang Sicong taking over the league, with the exception that in his recent broadcast of Demacia Cup, there was a 5-hour delay. So they're apprehensive about that, because they don't want, because he also Banana Plan ran Demacia Cup, so they don't want that. But other than that, they're not really apprehensive about PLU getting kicked out in particular. So the idea that PLU has invested so much, and I know this past year, right, in 2014 you watched the screen and the video quality wasn't that great, 480p or something like that. It fluctuated, but you could get a pretty good all this year, at least 720, and they had gotten a bigger venue, they put a bunch of stuff on the stage, they hired new casters, because that was a really big issue that the Chinese people had with the PLU production, is that they didn't like the Chinese casters. So they still kept a lot of the casters that they didn't really like a lot of the Chinese have complained about Miss, which is really funny because she won most popular caster at the award ceremony in Demacia Cup, but they've hired really, really popular casters like Sika and Xiao Xiao. So they tried to make these changes, and they invested a lot in getting these sponsors and all this stuff. But then still, they said, okay, Riot Games made the decision, and I heard that they were really interested in producing the league themselves, and they were considering taking that right from Tencent to distribute the league content. Like Tencent originally had the power to say, this organization can run a tournament, and this organization can run the tournament. So the question is whether Riot was able to obtain those rights, or if Tencent is the one still saying, we're giving it to Banana Plan. That's the big question that I have on this, is whether Tencent or Riot are controlling who is producing the league now.
Do either of you have anything else to follow up on that?
She pretty much touched on it for me. Yeah, it's a big issue as it is.
Yeah, it seems like one giant question mark about this all, one that we probably won't really get many answers to as of yet. But I mean, to talk about production quality, since that's something we wanted to talk about afterwards. So, would you say that the finals for Demacia Cup, they kind of really went all out? What do you think that that's sort of like a good precursor for what to expect with the upcoming LPL season? I mean, I know that there's already been reported news that several OGN producers have left and will be working with LPL starting from this season. So, what can we expect with that? Any one of you can start.
It wasn't necessarily the production values themselves, just obviously the delays were ridiculous. So I mean, that is an issue, and I'm not sure, there are certain infrastructural issues with Chinese internet that are never going to be solved regardless of who runs the production. So I'm not sure that that will ever honestly be able to be fixed, other than going in and hand redoing the entire internet infrastructure in China. So I mean, the OGN producers that left, I'm really curious about that. Obviously, there's the recent uproar about the Korean broadcasting rights that's going on right now, with them taking away some of those rights from OGN. So now that we're getting the pieces from Korea, that makes a lot more sense as to why these producers left. At Demacia Cup, they had super popular K-pop groups opening the stage show. I guess I'm curious to see what the production values will be, in spite of the fact that I actually think PLUs, in my opinion, weren't awful, but I also don't have that long-standing grudge against them like probably a lot of Chinese fans do. But like, I thought their stage was really cool.
Yeah, I think. Go ahead, Grass.
I was just about to say, I thought the production value as a whole, we already touched on it and how it improved leaps and bounds. A little bit, I guess, something maybe I didn't like it as much. I don't know. I was talking specifically about LSPL because I like the kind of the home feel of it, and they kind of made a joke of it in the sense that it was fun to watch back then. Now it's a lot more serious. The castings one upped as well. I guess there are good and bad things to it all. I like the production value. It's going to be interesting to see how it'll improve now that they've gone to the next level, essentially. So that's my take on it.
And I don't know about LSPL actually. I don't think PLU actually has had the rights necessarily of LSPL. I think it was a different company that produced the LSPL. So that's an interesting question also if Wang Sicong went ahead and bought LSPL. So
well, if he hasn't, he might later, just because he can. I mean, yeah, it seems like just based on how much, considering how much money he has, we could sort of deduce that they have a larger budget to work with, and from that we can sort of, I don't know if it's fair to assume that production quality could increase. I don't know, like, again, in terms of like the delay, I mean, that seems like something that could be out of their power, as Emily said. But I mean, there's a lot of like there's a lot of we could speculate on, since that is something that's really important to fans and the viewing experience of it all.
That is, by the way, you guys did hear why they said that the 5-hour delay occurred, right?
It was because, wasn't there like some weird hardware issue?
Yeah,
it was completely their fault. I do remember that. Like, it was
some player had forgotten his usual keyboard and peripherals, and so the backup keyboard and peripherals that they had were not compatible with the computer itself. So someone had to go and get other peripherals, and for some reason this took 5 hours, and
oh my god.
They just had a stock room full of like keyboards from like desktops from 1995.
It's like, use them all. Please test them all, every single one of them.
But
it's just like, go on.
Sorry, but in regards to the delays, I kind of feel like that's something that this is the first time Banana Plan put on a big production like that, and that sort of situation is something that they can learn from. The rest of the days went off pretty on schedule for China, which means like within the wiggle room of a half-hour delay. And so aside from that, there was a lot of production value. And then during the delay, like, he bought the entire audience dinner and served them burgers and things like this.
Something only Wang Sicong can do.
I just don't even understand.
You just don't even understand how someone could have that much money. I think we can all just feel like that's just like, wow.
And it was this massive stadium too. It was like this 54,000 seater stadium, and then they had in Wuhan. And
there's a joke about this. It's like in all of this, there's a joke about taking the entire audience to dinner. Something about that.
Yeah, there are several jokes like, will these new OGN producers be able to fix computers? And
one could only hope.
But yeah, so he also, and as we touched on, they hired the big K-pop groups. They hired 2 sportscasters from football that are really, really popular in China. So he just like hired them, and they're now allegedly going to be working for the LPL next year. So, and the question though is, can he maintain like this level of over the topness, right? throughout the year. Supposedly, Wanda Group helped him with the specific Demacia Cup production, his father's company. So this is something that hasn't really happened a lot. Wanda Group and Wang Zhenlin has preferred to remain removed from his son's deviant activities. And so Wanda Group's involvement is actually really big. The same reason why when the Snake had the China Rare Earth logo on it last year, because Snake's father, the Snake owner's father, owns China Rare Earth, which is this really big, rare earth company that provides not just Chinese rare earth, but rare earth materials all over the world. So the fact that they had that on their jacket, and like the rich guy was actively associating himself with his son's like gaming company, was sort of like very strange. And so similar with Wanda Group helping out with the Demacia Cup, we don't know if Wanda Group will have that much involvement in the LPL, so that's a big question on that as well.
Just like on a side note, when you said he doesn't want to be involved in his son's deviant activities, like the first thought was like that picture of Wang Sicong with like all those girls dressed up with like the cat ears. And, like, and I just have to imagine that Wang Sicong is so. I mean, his father's kind of just like he just like opens up like whatever tabloid magazine sees that and is kind of just like, oh my god. But it's like he's probably like he's his only like child, so he has to like put up with him. It's kind of just like, oh my god. It's kind of just.
Still
like,
love him. I still love him.
The benefits of the benefits of the one-child policy.
He basically just has to like just bite his knuckles and just like have to tell himself like, I love him. He's all I have. He's all I have. But yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say like it was pretty ostentatious, but considering it was the finals, it's a little. I think it's fair to say that the regular LPL season won't be as over the top. Maybe like the definitely the finals for sure. I think that's fair to say. But I mean, I feel like just an overall increase of, maybe maybe like a change of venue for the regular season, or just, better, a nicer stage is sort of like the stuff that's like that I think is more fair to, think to speculate about like those about like the regular season. But I mean, again, I guess we'll see soon enough, right?
So that's pretty much my expectation too, that like the regular season's probably going to be like, even PLU downgraded their stage, right, between between spring and summer. Actually, like honestly, like the spring stage is a little much for me. I actually prefer the summer stage, but I think it's going to be something like that, where they're going to have, the regular season of LPL is just going to have pretty straightforward, solid production values, and then they'll do like a crazy opening with all the popular players. And then if they're all IG players, then we'll know, right? Like it's just rookie and Zatai, like on a
their team intro is going to be 5 seconds longer than everyone else's. Just saying.
We also
get so disappointed in the team.
The hookers and the cat ears come out. No, I didn't mean to say they're hookers. Okay, they might be very nice ladies who just like hanging out with Wang Sicong with cat ears on. Okay.
I mean, I'm pretty sure with his money, he could probably ask any woman to put on cat ears for him. But I mean, again, I think like regardless if Wanda Group is going to continue backing him throughout like the regular season, it seems like budget isn't really going to be much of an issue regardless. I mean, is that fair to say?
The motivation might be an issue.
Yeah, that's a good point. You should talk about that.
Okay, so Wang Sicong, from what I understand, is someone who loses motivation on a certain project, specifically IG.
I never would have guessed.
What?
Specifically Invictus Gaming. So if you remember, a lot of the management issues that came down with Invictus Gaming was just simply. I think Kelsey can really open this up a little bit more. Perhaps she has more knowledge about the inner workings of Invictus Gaming. Something that I'm not fully aware of.
The only stuff I know is really the stuff that was made public because I don't
Okay.
really talk to a lot of people in Invictus Gaming, but there was an issue where one of like the Chinese coach complained about the situation of the house where a lot of things were broken or the players were distracted and not getting along, and he just eventually he took matters into his own hands and he was publishing the statement now, and then mysteriously he was no longer with the organization a few weeks later. There was stuff about Mafa not really feeling respected by the players, and of course the management didn't back up or reinforce his decision making, so he kind of checked out halfway through summer and started duoing with Zero a lot in ARAMs, which also explains a lot about what King did.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of overall you get the sense that this team is not extremely well run, and that the owner probably didn't get involved in certain situations that he should have.
Okay, so this is sort of maybe possibly a red flag for you in terms of how he might manage the LPL broadcast?
Well, the thing is that he's created his own company.
Yeah.
So allegedly he won't be controlling everything, or if he is controlling everything and he gets bored, he has people in place to control everything in his situation. I do think this year his main focus, like his main project is, as we already mentioned, is the Panda TV streaming site. Like this is going to be his baby, I think, for the next year, the thing that he cares the most about.
Yeah.
You're just going to see Rookie on like the front page every single day with like just like 3 times bigger than every other player's little
He's gonna have
frame.
his own channel that's just him singing songs to you all
No,
day.
it's really funny because since the players are still contracted to Zanchi, and they can't break that contract yet, they still stream on Zanchi even though Wang Sicong has his own streaming platform.
As of so far, we'll see what's going to happen.
Part of the rumor that UZI was going to Invictus Gaming that went on for a while was that he had switched streaming platforms to Panda TV.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But that doesn't necessarily mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so is there anything else we want to talk about in regards to Banana Plan acquiring rights to the broadcast of LPL at all? Like anything that you feel like you haven't touched on yet?
Yeah. I'm not even sure if this is like the truth. Well, yeah, I think there's a bit of truth in this, and I think it's just generally. I know there's a lot of expectation that people have in terms of, man, esports is actually gonna, it's gonna be on the same level as actual sports. You know, that's the general feel you get a lot, and maybe this topic is too general that it's kind of a joke, but no. My problem with this, and this extends to Korea as well, comes from the fact that when you go to actual sports like soccer, basketball, the biggest you don't get issues such as intellectual property doesn't come up. And so I feel like when you have, I think the biggest roadblock in terms of let's say with certain games, of course, like, well, with a lot of games, every game, intellectual property is always a big deal because if they want to venture into esports, they have a vision of where their game wants to go, and sometimes it's not the right decision, or sometimes it's a decision that has large risk or limits, and the biggest limiting factor, of course, is exclusivity. So of course with Riot, you're currently seeing SBO TV, OGN fiasco. In China, it's not that big of a deal, but they have their own vision of them running it. But of course, Banana. I was about to say Banana Planet. I was about to call it Banana Planet.
It's technically like the banana plan for the evolution of Chinese culture or something.
Oh my god, let's
ridiculous.
Not get
So that's why you will see various people calling it banana plan or banana culture or something like that, because there are so many words in the actual title. So
all we know
is by 2030, Wang Sicong will own his own planet, so watch out. Banana Planet is not that far out of reach yet.
But yeah,
my
general point just comes down to, of course, and you've seen Blizzard have their own thing with StarCraft and the wounds that come from that. So it's, For me, I feel like at every point in certain games growth in esports, they'll have the biggest problem that will always come back up is intellectual property. How much of the game really belongs to the game owners, the developers as well. So like it, so I remember there were ridiculous things being said like, oh well, every game that's played, every replay that's made essentially belongs to Riot, and Riot can DMCA or just generally they have the decision on it, and you'll never see that obviously in any sports because sport like the fuck like if I'm playing basketball like, no
All
one
you
rules
need is
over
the
that.
ball and at least one friend.
Yeah, like so that's the biggest thing that's really stopping it is essentially the game developers having, I wouldn't say them having a hand in it. Well, yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. But that's exactly.
If I wanted to be a PC, I wouldn't say this, but
but that's always my biggest worry because I do understand the vision that Riot has or the vision that Blizzard has, but oftentimes that vision limits. Not only is it extremely risky, but it limits their game's growth as well. So
Okay,
that's my
so
vision.
just to so just to sort of try to like bring it back a little bit. So so on this topic, you're just a little. So your main concern is sort of just allegedly what that Riot China have like allegedly having
Yeah.
a greater like being able to exercise their power a little bit better from this point forward. That sort of like is what's raising questions for you.
Yeah, pretty much. It just comes down to we've seen what a free, let's say we've seen what a free Korean league looks like, or we've seen what a free Chinese league looks like, and in a free Chinese league, unfortunately,
there are a
unfortunately
lot
for
of
some
problems.
people, there are a lot of problems. There are a lot of problems, but like when you cut down those freedoms, like for instance, there are a lot of rules right now that say, well, a lot of players are too young for the game, or a lot of players. Actually, I feel like that's the biggest topic really.
Or elo boosting.
Or elo
boosting.
boosting. Elo boosting is a big one, and I feel like okay, my biggest thing on elo boosting, I think we've already discussed it to be honest in previous episodes. Just to bring it back up comes like to the culture really and the approach that Riot is taking with it, and they haven't taken really any approach on it yet in terms of China, but they've taken it on like LMS, and we've seen how those players and how they've approached that culture or that scene. And I think it's remember how they approached it in North America. And although there wasn't a culture in North America, the way they approached it was they made public warnings for these players. They didn't completely shit on their career on the first go. Like they said, okay, here are the players. You have been warned. Essentially, they put it up on their website, and so the players looked at it and it's like, okay, I better like it's season 2 going into season 3. I better not do this. I want to continue playing this game, and I'm sure if given the same opportunity, a lot of these the players that did get suspended or banned for a certain amount of time would have done the same thing. They would have made the same like if they had been given that public warning rather than an immediate ban, would have been better for them. But the approach is the biggest one. I just want them to do it right. Everyone wants them to do it right, but I just feel like that's not the path we're going down.
I think that's a legitimate concern based on how Riot has sort of exercised their power in other regions, but I think it's important to know that they've had difficulty exercising that same amount of power in China, and though they have said that they will be exercising more of it from this point on after the change of ownership, it's still sort of more like a big if they can. It's saying that they are going to, it could just be for show, and it'll still just be out of their power for the most part. I mean, that's the feeling I'm getting. It seems like it seems very. I'm just very skeptical that they'll go from having very little to having extensive power over the game. But I mean, I guess we'll sort of see.
I think
An interesting thing that Raz brought up too, like in comparison to traditional sports, a lot of times you see traditional sports in the United States anyway, because I can really only speak to United States and then oddly enough
Yeah.
baseball in Japan. But because I know a lot about that. But
Yeah.
like it's you see a lot of these sports are intrinsically tied with hey, political affiliations or big economic movements in US history or in the case of baseball, Japanese history. And it's interesting only in China, and I know like China isn't on the hot list after Worlds and everyone's just sitting there saying China sucks, etc., etc., but only in China do you have the streaming of online games, and specifically League of Legends, because it's wildly popular and it's owned by Tencent, who also has QQ, that it's so intrinsically tied with politics and economics. And that's something that's really important to note about trying to exercise control over League of Legends in China, is that only in Chinese culture is it such a huge part of like political motivations or even like personal motivations in terms of the way Chinese youth feel about economics and politics in general.
Another really important thing to consider is that in terms of Riot branches in League of Legends, Riot China is a fairly new branch of Riot. They used to have like Riot Hong Kong, which was kind of proxy, like how they related to Tencent, but they more or less trusted Tencent to control the league, to control and distribute the game in China. So Riot China, the branch, I think was built and became like fully operational, at least. It probably existed in like some small part before within this past year. So it's almost as if Riot China is coming in and saying we want to exert more influence, more control in this area, which there are positive things that I think people have accepted about that, and there will also be almost this OGN-esque issue where it's like, we've done esports, we've done this league for so long, suddenly you're telling us what we can and can't do. So the fact that Riot China is so new in having an influence in the LPL is, I think, something that also differentiates this situation from other leagues.
I think that's actually a very fair point, and that's actually something that could, factor into how much they can, exercise their own power. Okay, we've actually been talking about this topic for a while, and I think it's really important, and I honestly think we could, talk about this for like another hour just because it's very interesting and there's just a lot of question marks, and, it's just, we can keep going deeper and deeper, but I still want to touch upon some other stuff. So are there any final thoughts on this? Any like, what are your overall like impressions of the change? Positive, negative, neutral? Let's start. I'll do it one by one. Kelsey, let's start with you.
Overall, I think it's interesting that just Wang Sicong as a figure, for me, how encompassing he is, like the political realm, also the video game realm, how much money he has, the fact that it almost seems as if, like, I don't know exactly how this went down, but it almost seems as if he not only outbid other Chinese companies for the league, but also Riot China for the administration and the broadcasting rights. So that's kind of what the perception seems to be. I don't know if it's accurate or not. One thing we haven't really touched on yet is that PLU, the company that used to broadcast and administer the LPL, actually created the Longzhu streaming platform and the Longzhu company. So they get a lot of these two companies are financially connected, and PLU supports Longzhu. So the fact that PLU is losing the LPL broadcast rights means also they lose a lot of the sponsors that went with that, most likely. So the question now becomes how that affects those who care about the Incredible Miracle, the Longzhu Incredible Miracle team, how much money they have to put together the roster that they wanted, right? The big Korean powerhouse roster, the super team, and whether or not they'll actually finally get that roster. It's important to note that Longzhu is a company, right, that's backed by this guy who's been in esports for 10 years, very long time, really cares about the scene, but he's not gonna be your Chinese billionaire. They actually struggled in 2014. That's why the production value was really low to financially support the LPL until they got a lot of their 2015 sponsors. So just thinking about that, right? In conjunction with the IT, they still have Crossfire, which is really lucrative production for them, and they've been funneling more of their energy into that. This is just the question. I'm excited about Longzhu, but this is another thing that Banana Plan taking over LPL will impact, right?
And I think another thing, just piggybacking on that really quickly, it's not a matter of outbidding Korean teams because unfortunately Korean teams don't really pay their players as well. But it's a matter that when Longzhu initially said like, oh, we have all this money, we want to get this star-studded lineup. Some of those players like they were looking at had played in China, like Spirit is probably the largest one, and then Mata. And obviously it's not a matter of like they're rich or like what they had in terms of money to work with in comparison to the majority of Korean teams was a significant amount of money. It was a lot more than any other like Korean organization was investing. But then still in comparison to the Chinese organizations, there's still like a very large gap. So as someone who cares deeply about Korean League of Legends and wishes that they would pay their players better, that's something that I care about personally, I guess. So I am apprehensive about how that's going to affect Incredible Miracle going forward.
Yeah, so basically this high profile roster that they wanted might not actually happen because of this change.
Right.
Okay. So let's move on. Raz, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think that rant earlier was good enough, to be honest.
What about you,
It was
Emily?
a good rant. It was something I hadn't really thought about. So
Yeah, I think you should listen to Raz's rant as to why like comparing traditional sports to esports doesn't really work.
It was a good rant indeed.